Hi there, my name is Anupa Mukherjee. Recently, I came across a video on YouTube titled Free Palestine? No thanks. The Israeli Perspective. I've been trying to understand the Israeli perspective a long time, so I watched the video, and I must say I'm not disappointed. Congratulations to the gentleman for producing a well-researched, fact-based argument. I learned a few new things. But there are a few points he mentioned that I'd like to respond to.
Like most of the Arab Muslim countries, Israel is a democracy. I'm not afraid of the government preventing me from expressing my thoughts. Israel is not Iran or Syria or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Gaza.
Well, Israel is a democracy, but for you, as a white Jew, you have the right to vote, you have the right to select your government, you have the right to criticize your government. But the Palestinians don't have that right. So, as far as I'm concerned, Israel is as much a democracy as South Africa was during apartheid.
Ethnic cleansing is a very powerful expression. If in 1948 there were around 700,000 Palestinians and today there are 7 million in the land of Israel, you can't really use this term. However, if you want to use the words ethnic cleansing, you can do so to describe what happened to the Jews in Arab countries.
700,000 Palestinians have become 7 million Palestinians. But during the same period, 600,000 Jews have become 10 million Jews in Israel. And just because the population of Palestinians increased during this period does not mean that attempts at ethnic cleansing haven't happened. It just means you haven't been successful at it yet. But if you look at the events of the last 50 years, what's been happening over the last 20 years, the last 4-5 years in the West Bank, and even the current bombardment and siege of Gaza can be viewed by many as ethnic cleansing and genocide put together.
Everyone is obsessed with the Palestinian refugees. Did you know that the UN has 2 agencies for refugees? One for hundreds of millions of refugees all over the world, and another one called UNRWA, which is only for the most privileged refugees on earth, the Palestinians.
That is a very insensitive thing to say, my friend. Privileged refugees. But you have to accept, in order to be a privileged refugee, first you have to be a refugee, which means you are seeking refuge from someone, like an oppressor, an occupier, a tyrant. So if Palestinians are privileged refugees, remind me again, is it Israel they're seeking refuge from?
When Jews get married, part of the ceremony is to say that we will never forget Jerusalem. Jews have almost always lived in Jerusalem, even under the harshest conditions. Since the 13th century, the Muslims haven't allowed the Jews to pray at their holiest site, the Temple Mount, where Jews allowed for the first time in 700 years to enter the second holiest place for Jews. Why do I say liberated Hebron and not conquered? I will get to that in a minute. And now we get to the interesting part, the 19th century and Zionism. Jews have always migrated, or as we say in Hebrew, gone up to the land of Israel. Here is a challenge for you. Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs from the 7th century when the Arab Caliphate colonized the land of Israel until 1947 when the Arabs started a war to wipe out the Jews. From the year 636 till 1947 until it was brought back into Jewish hands in 1967. You want more names of Jewish villages that were abandoned because of Arab violence? Here are some more. Jewish civilians in the land of Israel many years before the occupation and many years before the land of Israel was established. Christians suffered as well.
Sure, I'll give you that. I think everything that you're saying is absolutely true. So what I understand is this was your land, your home, your place of worship. And over the last couple of thousand years, you've been driven out of here. The place has been ethnically cleansed by the Christians, by the Arabs. And after so long, this is your time in history to come back and reclaim your land. Absolutely, I'm with you on that. But only if you're willing to apply this rule universally, which means, are you willing to tell white Americans, some of whom may be your family or friends, that they should give the land back to the Native Americans and go off to Europe or Israel or wherever else they came from? Are you willing to do that? On this whole point of trying to correct the wrongs of history, I'm going to leave it to your fellow countryman Yuval Noah Harari. He'll say it better than I ever can.
As a historian, I know that the curse of history, the worst thing about history, is that people try to correct the past, people try to save the past, and this is impossible. You cannot go back to the past and save the people there, or to prevent the past injuries. We need to look to the future.
From 1970 till 1948, the British and the French were in control of the Middle East. The Jews blamed the British for being pro-Arab, and the Arabs blamed the British for being pro-Jewish. I will tell it as it was. The British were pro-British. They had two main interests in the region: to have oil flowing from Iraq to the port of Haifa, and to ensure the Suez Canal remained open. And because both of these interests lay in the hands of the Arabs, they were pro-Arab.
I completely agree with you on the British being neither pro-Arab nor pro-Jew, but being pro-British. And given that oil resources were controlled by Arabs at the time, they were more pro-Arab. Until World War I. Halfway through World War I, there was a very real possibility of the Axis powers taking control of the Middle East and the oil resources. That's when the British approached Rothschilds for help. Rothschilds, the generous people that they have always been, agreed to help. But then, you know that story about the pound of flesh? That kind of happened. And that's what led to the Balfour Agreement.
I find it absurd that people like my great-grandmother, who came to Israel from Eastern Europe in the 1920s, after dreaming about the Jewish homeland for generations, are seen as white colonialists, while Egyptians who came to work for the British in 1945 are seen as native Palestinians.
Now I'm curious, if this is how you feel about this subject, I really want to know, how do you feel about a Jewish American who lands up in Israel for the first time in his life, and within 3 days is taken to West Bank, put in a house that doesn't belong to him. The inhabitants who'd been living there for 70 years have been thrown out to be replaced by him only because he's Jew and supposedly has the first right to live in that place? How do you feel about that?
In 1947, the UN proposed the division of the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no, and then started a war in a bid to eliminate the Jews. The morning after the partition plan, Palestinians attacked a bus and murdered 5 Jews. This is how the war was started. They were offered a state, they said no, and start murdering Jewish civilians. Not a single Jew was spared in all of the places that fell into local Palestinian hands. Luckily for us, after 15 months of fighting the local Arabs and the 5 Arab armies that invaded Israel, we won. And yes, during the War of Independence, many Arab villages were destroyed and about 700,000 people were displaced. That's what happens when you try to wipe out your neighbors. You might well lose and have to pay the price. At the same time, 800,000 Jews were brutally expelled from Muslim countries.
But of course, the Arabs would fight. This was their land. A foreign country comes, carves it in half, gives half to some other people, and you expect them to accept it gladly? Just like Israel has a right to defend itself, so do the others. So the Arabs didn't like the solution, it was being thrust upon them, and they fought. And Israel fought back. And kudos to you guys, you won. So that's where I think the line needs to be drawn. You know, analyzing or trying to interpret any current problem, I feel one needs to look at history or a timeline that's relevant to the context. In the case of Israel and Palestine, I feel 1947 is where the new history begins. And 1947 is the line that we need to go to. That's the line that needs to be respected. Unfortunately, since 1967, Israel has not been respecting it. Over the last 10, 20 years, last 5 years, there's gross disrespect for that line. And that's what's causing the problem. But then, why should you listen to me? Let's hear Bertrand Russell, the great mathematician, philosopher, Nobel Prize winner for literature, pacifist, humanist, visionary. This is what he said in 1970. This is a letter he wrote one day before he died, talking about the Israel-Palestine situation. Let's hear him.
The tragedy of the people of Palestine is that their country was given by a foreign power to another people for the creation of a new state. Now, Russell doesn't mention it, but I'm sure he's referring to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, of course, issued by the British government. The result was that many hundreds of thousands of innocent people were made permanently homeless. With every new conflict, their numbers have increased. How true that is still. How much longer is the world willing to endure this spectacle of wanton cruelty? And what would he have made of the images we see today on television and online and Twitter? It is abundantly clear that the refugees have every right to the homeland from which they were driven. And the denial of this right is at the heart of the continuing conflict. No people anywhere in the world would accept being expelled en masse from their own country. How can anyone require the people of Palestine to accept a punishment which no one else would tolerate? A permanent just settlement of the refugees in their homeland is an essential ingredient of any genuine settlement in the Middle East. So notice how here for Russell, a just settlement is the key point here. As a philosopher, very concerned with justice, not just expediency, but with a right and proper outcome. He continues, we are frequently told that we must sympathize with Israel because of the suffering of the Jews in Europe at the hands of the Nazis. I see in this suggestion no reason to perpetuate any suffering. What Israel is doing today cannot be condoned. In other words, it can't be approved of. This is in 1970. And to invoke the horrors of the past to justify those of the present is gross hypocrisy. Justice, this word again, justice, requires that the first step towards a settlement must be an Israeli withdrawal from all the territories occupied in June 1967. A new world campaign is needed to help bring justice to the long-suffering people of the Middle East. End quote.
So what do we do then? We're all here. This is the situation. What's the solution? Hearing you talk about all the atrocities and expulsions and tortures that the Jewish people had to face over the last couple of thousand years made me remember this poem by W.H. Auden, who wrote, and let me try to remember it exactly. To those that evil is done, do evil in return. If he is right, Israel's actions of the last 50, 70 years can probably be explained by what they went through for so long. By the same logic, what the Palestinians have gone through for the last 50, 70 years could explain the evilness of Hamas as they showed on 7th of October. But then, if Auden is right, where does this perpetual cycle of violence end? Because to those evil is done, they do evil in return. But then the victims are somebody else who then do evil in return. And so on and so forth it goes. And if we continue the cycle, then I think eventually the final nail in the coffin will be a nuclear bomb. And we don't really want to get there, right? One has to ask, is there a solution to this militarily? Will violence lead to peace? And with that context, what sense does this crazy war in Gaza make to anybody? how can it be defended? How is it the solution to anything? I will end with Yuval Noah Harari again.
Ideally, we should be able to disarm Hamas and to go back to the Saudi deal, to restart the peace process from a better position with a different Israeli leadership, which appreciates the fact that giving the Palestinians hope for the future and enabling the Palestinians to live dignified lives and to have their own state in their homeland is in Israel's best interest. It's not a concession we are making for others. This is something for our future as well.
I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. I'd love to hear all sides of the story. So please feel free to comment, and thanks for watching till the end. Goodbye.